Shalom, shalom, friends, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to a episode of Un-Apologetics, where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Today's episode is going to be a open room. It is open topic, although this is actually an after show for a debate that was had on the Gospel Truths channel between DB Ramsey and Samuel Nesan. So anybody who wishes to talk about that will, of course, get precedent. The topic they were speaking of was whether or not evil disproved the Christian God, which is obviously, of course, just a play on the typical, already known problem of evil. And so this is going to be a after show of that. Of course, open mic for anybody who wants to give comments on that, anything like that. It is going to be open topic and open to everybody. Just precedent for people who wish to discuss either A, the debate itself because they watched it, or B, the topic of the debate, which was, does evil disprove the Christian God? And or you could phrase that obviously in just the typical problem of evil. Link to join is in the description. I have also gotten it posted to the live chat. So if anybody wants to join, of course, you certainly can. Going to go ahead and stall a little bit for time here just to allow people to actually come in. I do see Jamie Russell in the live chat. Shalom, brother. Also, LPP. Shalom also to you. He says, where is the debate happening? The debate actually already happened. About 15 minutes ago it ended, and it was over on the Gospel Truths channel. I also see here Kelvy Cuello. I'm sorry if I did not say that correctly. I think I recognize you from over at the Gospel Truth live chat. I think I saw you commenting there, but shalom and thank you for being here. I see you say here that you decided to subscribe, so I appreciate that very much. On that note, anybody who is here who is not subscribed, please do consider doing so. Hit that bell if you want to get notified every time we have a episode. And of course, like and share this video so that we can actually get this out to other people. What good is a show without an audience to hear it? And by the way, I see Shalom Nightmare. Good to have you here as well. And of course, anybody else who is here and is not commented as well. So while we're waiting, let me give some of my comments on the conversation. So the debate, again, was between Samuel Nesan, a Christian apologist, and DB Ramsey, a, I guess, agnostic is what you would call him, speaker and author. I say, I guess, agnostic just because he does seem to have, like, open, it does seem to have a level of openness, about God potentially existing in a somewhat deistic fashion. That whole kind of cliche of, I think that God exists, but none of the religions know him kind of thing, right? I'm calling him DB Ramsey because it'll more easily differentiate him from another person who shares his same name, namely Dave Ramsey, the financial advisor. But his name was actually in the debate listed as Dave Ramsey. I'm sure he probably goes by Dave Ramsey most times. I'm calling him DB Ramsey because it is still technically his name, and it is a way to differentiate him from the financial advisor. But nonetheless, he is a deconverted Christian. He says he was a minister in, I think, the Baptist denomination before he actually was a speaker for non-belief. And he was not actually making the argument that evil disproves the God of Christianity, which I found rather interesting. I would have thought that he might want to better hammer out what exactly it is he would be defending rather than accepting the thesis as it was put forward. Because, if you just take the thesis at face value, both debaters agreed that the answer is no. And just sort of agreed right out the gate. So that was interesting. But nonetheless, his argument was really that evil exposes a Christian God, which, to be fair, is a little bit more honest of a argument than saying that the problem of evil disproves the Christian God. I personally have always kind of laughed at the notion that because God is mean and we don't like him, therefore he must not exist, right? That seems completely preposterous and illogical to me, and to the nth extent, I might add. It seems much more consistent to say that the problem of evil is something that leads one to say that maybe they don't, like I said, that they don't like God, that maybe they don't want to follow God, that maybe they think God is exposed, or that God is an evil being. Maybe they argue for maltheism or something like that, right? That, at least to me, seems more consistent than, no, bad things happen, therefore I don't think God exists. Although typically what people are saying when they actually make that argument is bad things happen, therefore I don't believe a all-loving or omnibenevolent God exists, which is sort of a steelman version of what they would put forward, right? And he lists some of the different things that occur. Some pretty heavy, what I would consider to be appeals to emotion. Some of these things he takes from the Bible, such as saying, God floods the earth, killing all of the innocent children who are on the earth, and God destroys Job's life because he has a bet with Hasatan. And he had a third example that I don't actually recall off the top of my head that came directly from the Bible, but he also used the example of there are, I think, 10 million children who pass as children every day, and that this is roughly the equivalent of one every 5 seconds. And these were sort of his points to say that, if God does exist, I think that he's evil, kind of a thing, right? And I do kind of think, unfortunately, I don't mean to be rude or dismissive to Mr. Ramsey or to his arguments, but I think in the end, that sort of emotive reasoning is kind of as far as we got in D.B. Ramsey's argumentation. It seems to me that he wasn't actually able to provide us a solid argument as to why these things were evil to begin with, right? In other words, he wasn't able to ground his morality. He wasn't able to give us a solid argument as to why these things could not possibly have a justified reason for occurring, or could not possibly have, be involved in God's plan somehow. He just sort of dismissed it and said, well, if that's the God that you serve, I don't really believe it, right? And that's fine. I mean, that's you can make that argument, I guess. You can live your life whatever way you want to live your life, of course, right? But it's not really a solid scholarly or philosophical argument, right? You're basically just saying, I don't like the way the world is, and so I don't think that the person who created this world, if there is such a person, is somebody I should serve. And that's perfectly fine. Like that you have every right, again, as a free moral agent and as a free citizen in this country as well, to have that belief. But I don't see any reason why that should be convincing for somebody like me, right? Or anyone else for that matter. Furthermore, and even more problematically, I think the examples that were given, he doesn't have a fleshed out philosophy as to why these things are evil. And in fact, I think, like most atheists, he ends up creating a more evil, quote unquote, God in the process. So let me give an example of what I mean, just in case anybody's confused by my wording. In the Genesis story, God, of course, floods the entire world, and many, many, many people who are on the scoffing side, not just Ramsey, of course, Tom Jump, Skylar Fiction, Raging Atheist, so on and so forth, Richard Dawkins, blah, 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 right? They say this is such a horrible event, and God, he slaughtered, obviously, all of the innocent babies as well, and it's a terrible way to die, and it's, how could God just destroy all humanity like this, blah, 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 so on and so forth, right? Ask people the question when they say this: is a judge actually just or righteous or lawful, or whatever word you want to use, if he just sees somebody who is committing murder, sees somebody who's committing animal cruelty, sees somebody who's committing spousal abuse or rape, sees somebody who's committing constant thievery, right? If he takes this person, he sees this person, he has this person in his court, and he has the evidence against this person, is this judge just, justified, righteous, whatever you want to say, to just let the person walk and do nothing? Of course not. Of course not. In fact, not only is he not just to do such a thing, but when that person inevitably goes and reoffends, because we know that this thing occurs all the time, or at least somebody who he lets go reoffends, probably more than one person, right? It's not going to be everybody, of course. But when this occurs, we almost in unison will jump out of our seats and yell, this judge is evil. He needs to be disbarred. Some people would even go as far as to say he needs to have some kind of legal penalty against him, right? Regardless of what side of that you actually sit on, I guarantee you're on the side of, no, this judge is evil. This judge is not capable of being a judge. This judge needs to be disbarred and needs to have his right to be a judge taken away from him, right? And yet, all the atheists, all the scoffers demand of God that he be that judge, that he be a judge who is unwilling and or maybe even just unable, I guess I don't know which they prefer, to judge his creation, right? They don't allow for a God who is righteous, who is just, who hates wickedness, and who will destroy wickedness after many, many, many opportunities of allowing the wicked to repent and turn from their ways. I, of course, say this not boasting, but with a little bit of fear and trembling, because I, just like any other human being here, am a wicked person. We're all wicked people. Good people don't exist, right? We have evil intentions, evil thoughts, evil feelings in our own hearts, right? Our emotions lead us to act in selfish ways, etc., and etc. But just because it may not make me feel very good that God is actually just and God will actually judge the wicked, that doesn't mean that God is not just or that he is justified in not judging the wicked, right? I think that's fairly obvious. I think that it is honestly absurd, if I'm being frank, for the atheist and the scoffer to demand of God to allow evil to continue indefinitely and to not actually have a line where he's like, no, this culture is done, this person is done, this family is done, this religion is done, whatever it happens to be that he is actually putting final judgment on. And I think that when you create that kind of a God, that God who is not willing to send the flood, that God who is not willing to put the Canaanites under a final judgment, that God who does not have a final punishment in the afterlife, right? What you do, in effect, is you create a handicapped, feckling weakling of a God who is either cowardly or evil, right? And I don't think that is something that any of us would worship. I don't think that's something that any of us should worship. And I absolutely believe that is not the way that the Bible portrays God, just in case anybody wants to provide a Christian defense of that. As for some of the other examples that he gave, like, so for example, the Job example, I think when you kind of look at the story of Job, it's almost presented as if it's kind of like a heavenly court. And essentially what you have taking place in the book of Job is the prosecuting attorney in this instance throwing the books at Job as much as they possibly can, right? Trying to get this person, I guess, locked up, if you will, right? To kind of continue the analogy to make sure that they have clear and definite evidence against them. And God actually, rightfully, of course, says, sorry, that's not true. This person is not guilty. This person is my servant. He even goes as far as to call him perfect. And he's so confident in that he allows Job to be put in a situation where the prosecuting attorney, in this instance, Satan, should be favored, right? And yet Job, through his faith in God, proves that indeed the prosecutor in this instance is incorrect, that God is correct, that Job is strong of faith, that he is a morally upright man, regardless of the circumstances. And he is not only rewarded exponentially after the fact, right? But also, of course, he will be rewarded in a absolutely uncountable way in the hereafter. And of course, I hope to one day meet Job there. The example of babies dying every day, I would just quickly point out that, first off, under the Christian worldview, there is, death is not the first death. Of course, it is the second. There is a second death for those who are to be destroyed, and for those who are not, there is eternal life, right? So that is obviously, from God's perspective, that is not the taking of life in the same way, of course. There is also, of course, the fact that God is the ultimate taker of life. He takes life every single time that it is taken. It is by his pen that the story is told, right? He is the author in this example. He is the director in our movie. He is the playwright on this stage, and whatever other example you wish to use, right? The potter who makes the pot, etc. The point there being that the authority is ultimately in his hands, right? And we don't actually have the right to question that authority. Now, if we decide to, in humility, ask God, this seems cruel, we want to know, right? The way Abraham did, the way Moses did, the way others have done, right? God, I beseech thee, right? He does tend to answer the question. And he's not a cruel being who just does with his creations whatever it is that he, wants to do willy-nilly, like some kind of a tyrant playing with action figures or something like that, or a child playing with action figures, rather, or a tyrant, playing with groups that he considers to be an automaton. The God of the Bible does things to save, does things to build up, does things to show his love for humanity, does things to punish the wicked, does things to move forward the glorification of his kingdom, which is a kingdom which offers eternal life to those who will be in it. Just because God has the authority to do whatever it is that he sees fit does not mean that he is going around doing a whole bunch of evil things and playing with humans like there's some kind of like there's some kind of plaything, frankly, right? God is a just God. God is a kind God. God is a righteous, loving being who cares for his creations all the way down to the smallest fly. And of course, much more so those who are made in his image. And if you look throughout the scriptures, the different reasons why evil things are allowed to occur, right? We do see God is very clear with us. He has ultimate purpose in everything that he does. Right? God is very clear with us that there is punishment on the wicked for sin. That's one reason that we have penalties like that. God is very clear that sometimes we need personal growth, and that is a reason why wickedness occurs on this planet. God is very clear that there are instances where it would be, unfortunately, worse for this egregious thing not to occur. And, we often think of Joseph, and shalom, Brother Jamie, I'll have you have an opening here in just a second, but I just want to finish here real quick. We often, quote in this instance, when we're talking about God using things to his benefit and for good purposes, right? We often quote Joseph. Of course, that's a good example because it's from the Bible. It's in the past, though. An example that's much more modern, and this may be somewhat unfortunate for people to hear, but it's true, right? Think of the Holocaust. Because of that horrible, horrible, horrible thing, which is not justified, which the Nazis will indeed pay for in the afterlife, I firmly believe. But because of that thing, the Jews, for the first time in almost 2,000 years, have a homeland. They are home. They live in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem and in Nazareth, and so on and so forth, right? They have their own self-determination. They have the ability to govern themselves, to choose as a nation whether or not they would like to serve the God of their covenant. That did not occur in the 1800 years beforehand, or however long it ended up actually being, unfortunately, because there was nothing like the brutal, vicious, destructive, disgusting Holocaust to bring people together like that. Zionism existed, but it wasn't actually catching on, right? And that, I think, is an example that we in the future can see of what appears to be God's hand working in things that are horrible. And I would like to, at that point now, say shalom to Brother Jamie, and thank you for coming on. And how's it going?
Oh man, hauling some dirt, but in my yard. But I just wanted to say to you that at the risk of tooting your horn a little bit, where did you learn so much at such a young age?
Well, I appreciate that. I just have always been interested in study. Where most people, I guess, kind of wanted to, like play sports and go on a hike or something like that, or play video games. I've always really wanted to, watch documentaries and read books and things of that nature. But also, I have had the great blessing of being born to two grandparents and a father who were incredibly knowledgeable and wise in each in different ways. My grandfather is politically like a genius and economically a genius. And of course, I didn't have anything to do with that. My father, religiously speaking, he knows the Bible like the back of his hand. And my grandmother, historically speaking, is an absolutely brilliant woman, which is funny actually, because she's a English teacher, not a history teacher, but nonetheless. And those have been, kind of helped. Those have helped, add to, my ability to study and stuff like that.
Right on, man. I just so much of things you have to say have really been intriguing for me. And, just really cool to see. And I didn't mean like you're like good, knowledgeable for someone who's young. I mean, I didn't mean it like that either. I mean, I think you have really good thinking, and that's helpful to the kingdom of God. And I just wanted to say I appreciate that, and I want to help support you however I can.
Yeah, and I appreciate you, brother. Very much so. I appreciate the kind words. I don't know if if you guys are into the whole shout out thing at the end thing, but I am planning on getting a screen for all you guys who are contributing to me, if that's something that everybody's interested in.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, I don't need to for that, but I mean, I think it's a good idea to just garner support or whatever. I think it's nice to be acknowledged, people to be acknowledged and stuff. And I did enjoy your thing this morning as well with SJ, and having Jim come over too. That was really fascinating.
Yeah, I actually I like Jim Majors, actually. I've only had the 2 interactions with him so far, as well as listening to some of his previous conversations, but I've enjoyed the conversation so far. I obviously disagree vehemently.
Yeah.
And it is interesting because in a sense, I wish to see his work destroyed, right? And of course, vice versa. But also in another sense, these are like great conversations. But no, I actually like Jim is the point.
Yeah, and that came through too, and which I like. I'm more of that type person who would rather have it go that way. I think, it was, people are ready, just always have like a posture towards people, and you never really know, especially online, like what someone's background is and what they really are trying to do. And if it's just, they're just being, it's just their way of being, uneasy or whatever, how they express themselves. And it comes across as being, people take it all sorts of ways, and so I think that's a good example. I would appreciate that. And some of the stuff, I think he's still learning too. And I didn't think when SJ brought up that one guy who wrote that book on those patterns or whatever, I didn't think he was doing equidistant letter sequencing. I think that was like somebody else. I mean, isn't that right?
To be honest, I'm not too sure, just because the numerology thing isn't something I've given much study to or anything like that. I've always been a little bit more interested in the either philosophical aspect or the historical aspects, and of course theology. But theology just sort of comes with any territory at all. But the things like the numerology and stuff like that, I've never been too interested in, just so I don't have like a wide area of expertise or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm really, you might be surprised to hear me say this, but I'm a little bit, I'm weary of that sort of thing. I think equidistant letter sequence is almost completely just a computational joke kind of thing, like there's a few things that seem a little bit strange, but when you consider the way the manuscripts are came down to us, it's kind of hard to imagine how that could work, and I think the scholarship makes that pretty clear. You can figure that out. So yeah, I agree. But I do think there's thematic ideas that kind of tie it all together. But I'll have to read that book she recommended. Sorry to just really.
No, you're just totally fine. I'll be honest. I have like at least 12 or 13 books that I own that I have not read yet, so I can't actually add anything to my list at the moment. That's I'm not gonna lie. I'm like, you ever heard the guy at the guy at the buffet who, he takes more than he can actually eat, and he's got 3 plates, and then he actually only finishes like 1.5.
Yeah, that's me when I look in the mirror.
Yeah, I'm definitely that guy with books. I got to be honest with you. I own a ton of books, and I've read some of them for sure, but a lot of them are just kind of just there sitting because I haven't given them the time of day. But anyways, did you catch, out of curiosity, the debate on gospel truth?
No, I wish I had. I wasn't sure where it was, and I saw that on your thing, and but I'm interested. What was the topic again? The Nesan, right?
Yeah, so they were asking the question. It's basically the problem of evil, but the way that they phrased it exactly in the thesis was, does the existence of evil disprove the existence of the Christian God?
That's right. I heard you talking about that. I'm sorry. Yeah. You were saying how it is kind of funny how people think that the problem of evil somehow disproves God. I agree with you on what you were saying. Like, I also like what Alvin Plantinga says about that. It's kind of like, and the philosophical literature seems to have given up on that way of disproving God, or whatever, the atheist philosophical literature, because it basically all you have to do is posit that God possibly has some morally sufficient reason to allow evil, and the problem is no longer any kind of way of disproving God.
Yeah, and I honestly, there's a couple. I can't even say a couple, because really it's greater than that. There's so many different ways that one can address the problem of evil that it almost, I would almost be willing to have the same debate with the same person multiple times, just because there's so many different angles I feel like it could be approached at. Like, on one end, I could see the debate going the direction of what even is evil in the first place, right? Like, without a God, if a huge portion of atheists are just going to discount objective morality entirely, in which case the problem of evil is just, falls flat on its face at that point. If you're a subjectivist, then that the problem of evil is really the problem of personal preference. But if you are a moral objectivist and you're an atheist, what exactly does that mean? And how are you going to go about justifying that? And, they have tons of different ways they try. One of the more popular ones recently is imposition of will. Tom Jump has been kind of pushing that one a lot.
That's a joke to me. I give him so much trouble for that one. I just make crack jokes about it, because it's like, sorry, if there's no interaction between moral agents, then because like whatever goes to the cartoon world, well, anytime, I think that's what Clay Jones said to him, then it's not even a real world. Can there really be morals if you can't affect each other in any way?
Well, and I would even kind of point out too that like it kind of falls apart in both directions. And what I mean by that is, in one way, there are things which are almost universally agreed upon as evil, regardless of ethical system, or at least as wrong, that are clearly not impositions of will. So, for example, you have greed, right? And to be even more specific, not just greed, but the idea of like hoarding a whole bunch of resources, right? Resources even that you may have like rightfully owned, right? That is widely considered by people to be evil, right? When you have a Jeff Bezos, a John Rockefeller, somebody who just hoards and hoards and hoards and hoards all these resources to the detriment of other people, we often consider that to be a moral fault. But there's no imposition of will there. In fact, that's one of the biggest arguments of like objectivists like Ayn Rand, is that that person is actually acting not only in conjunction with their own will, but not in the imposition of anyone else's. And really, that's all that at least Ayn Rand thinks that you can expect of a person, is to be somebody who seeks their own benefit, even if it's to the detriment of others, so long as it's not necessarily directly imposing on their will or freedom, right? Which is interesting, actually. Now that I've put that connection together, I wonder if Tom Jump has any interest in Ayn Rand at all. But the point being, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I've never heard him talk about it. I listened to him, a fairly good amount, and but that's a good question. I'd like to know. I'll have to ask him.
And the point kind of ends up becoming, in that instance, right? The imposition of will argument doesn't work. Because that's something that now either Tom Jump has to concede that either there's something else that actually grounds this act as evil, or this act simply is not evil. And both of them are going to come with their fair share of problems, right? If he wants to argue the latter, then of course we can just say, okay, well, what's wrong with aristocracy? What's wrong with monarchy? What's wrong with completely out of check capitalism and stuff like that? Like, why not we just live in a huge dystopian thing where the strongest survive? Essentially social Darwinism, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, and he also says, I've asked him about this. I said, well, if people can't affect each other, like, he basically argues that all it is like basically there's no oughts. He makes it that part of it where there is no ought propositions. It's just bad is imposition of will of any kind. And so God should have made the universe where essentially we're all God, and we can choose to interact with other people in their universe or whatever. Otherwise, God makes it so you cannot have any kind of effect on anyone else. And also, that's basically it or whatever. And you'd have like God powers or whatever. Why couldn't have God done that? He didn't ask us if we wanted to be in this world. So he thinks that's immoral or something, but he has no oughts in his system. So you can lie, cheat, steal, do whatever, and it just won't affect anyone else, essentially. And there are no moral commands. So it's like, you might as well just deny morality.
Well, and exactly. And I use the greed and hoarding resources example, but really there's tons of things that we would all consider to be evil that are not actually direct impositions of will, right? Like just as in fact, I can go on a laundry list. So for example, incest is not a imposition on anyone's will. Necrophilia is not an imposition on anyone's will. Adultery, polygamy, right? These are obviously most sexual crimes are not imposition on somebody's will. Obviously there's the obvious ones that are, like rape and pedophilia, but for the most part, statutory rape, polygamy, necrophilia, adultery, none of these are imposition on anybody's will.
Yeah, that's what I tell him too. I joke with him. I'm like, I say, well, the thing is I gotta laugh because in your quote unquote moral landscape or whatever, you could have your own philosophical zombie pigs that you for a wife or whatever, and that's totally good. So I just kind of laugh at that.
I mean, right. And yeah, well, and interestingly enough, it even kind of, you could get in some dark things that I won't necessarily flesh out entirely because there's no need to go down that rabbit trail. But one could argue that due to the inability of certain parties to actually consent, it's not actually possible to impose on said party's will. In other words, they couldn't will one way or the other. Therefore, it's not possible to impose on that will. And at that point, I mean, you're now at a point where your moral system doesn't even account for things like bestiality and pedophilia because there's no will to impose on. You know what I mean? And that's obviously a dark place to go, but the point is made very strongly in it. And I think that, like, imposition of will does not account for immorality. It just simply doesn't. And the thing is there's also examples of imposition of will that are good, right? Like, yeah, exactly, right? Like putting people in prison when they commit a crime, or telling a child what they can and cannot do, or stopping a conquering army from trying to actually move in and take your resources, right? And tons of other things that exist. The point being that
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I know I'm being long-winded, so I'll make this last point brief. The point just being that in the one direction, namely, are there things that are imposition of will that are good? his argument fails. And in the other direction, which is, are there things that are not imposition of will which are bad? His argument again fails, right? And it's like, so the whole thing just disintegrates, really, when you actually start objectively looking at it and going through like moral crime by moral crime, right?
Yeah, the only reason I was like get a butt in is because I wanted to make a point on what you were saying before I forgot, but you're not being long-winded at all. But yeah, he'll say to that, he'll say, well, the only reason we have to do those things, like say impose will because of war, is because the chain of events in this world that led up to this, where we have to make decisions that are quote unquote, the lesser of two evils. So if it had all been like he suggests that if it had always been his way, we never would have had that crossroads or whatever to do the lesser of two evils. And so, I mean, that's a decent argument, but it fails in so many ways, like you're describing.
Well, and one other thing that I think it was actually originally pointed out. No, you know what? I can't say who it was originally pointed out by because of it would damage some image things. So I'm just going to say that this is an argument I did not come up with. But one of the things I've heard in refutation of Tom Jump's moral philosophy also is it basically forces one to conclude that antinatalism is good, because to be born against one's will, especially in a world that has abject suffering, would be a direct imposition of will. Now, of course, you could argue that there's no will to impose when the person hasn't been born yet, and I think that could be an interesting back and forth. But it does kind of seemingly indicate, at least, that antinatalism would be a good thing on that view.
Yeah, I do recall somebody bringing that up, actually. I think maybe I was talking to somebody about it. I'm not even sure. But yeah, in a way, I've also told him I thought his idea reminded me of kind of the idea of what Lucifer, it's not really in the Bible, I guess, per se, but he's basically advocating for the same kind of thing, that being your own God sort of thing, I can't even remember the details of that, but it just smacks of, anti-Christian ideas or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting too, because that we could continue to go on, and already have gone on a bunch about that just one system, right? But then you could continue to do the same thing with any other system too, right? Like if you say like morals come from natural law, or morals come from the maximizing flourishing for living creatures, and all these different things, you start dissecting them, they all start falling apart. In fact, I kind of love the evolutionary argument, and especially when it's coupled with the duty being maximizing well-being for conscious creatures, because I have now been able to, and I don't say this necessarily braggadociously or anything like that, right? Because it's all glory goes to God, number one, and number two, it's not like I don't have people who have presented me with difficult arguments as well, right? So I don't want to seem like, oh, I'm just laying the beat down on people or stuff like that. But it is interesting now. I've had conversations with Negation of P, Matthew Steele, Michael the Canadian Atheist, Tom Jump, Skylar Fiction, and the Raging Atheist, and with all of them have been provided no answers to the questions of not only who necessarily dictates what flourishing is, but most importantly, why examples of immoral things which clearly lead to increased human flourishing are bad. And we got, by the way, Jonathan Sheffield in the house. Shalom, brother.
Hey, shalom.
Real quick, I'm gonna pass to you in a moment, but I want to finish this point real briefly. But I've used now two examples with these people, and in fact, I can add a third here tonight, of egregiously evil acts increasing human flourishing in the long run, and then forcing them, if human flourishing is the goal, how do you actually come to the conclusion that these things are bad, right? And so the first example has always been, because it's the most obvious one, social Darwinism. If Adolf Hitler actually had the ability to deduce what was an objectively negative and an objectively positive trait and create like a race of superhumans, how does the person whose philosophy is based in human flourishing justify not terminating those who are considered to be deficient, especially if that person happens to be pro-choice? Because now you have a completely separate element, right? Now you support increased human flourishing, which this would objectively lead to, but also you support terminating fetuses in the womb, which would mean we could stop these people from living before they ever actually had consciousness. You see, and so you start forcing the person who defends the idea of, quote, conscious flourishing into a position where they're starting to sound an awful lot like a eugenicist. You know what I mean?
Yep.
You can also, the second example is like the Rockefellers, right? People who used objectively evil and abusive business practices, but in the end, these led to immense prosperity for humans all around, giving us the car, giving us the ability to have fossil fuels, giving us, of course, and think of what the car has provided us, right? Not only is the car the ability to drive places, but it's also the ability to get the guy who lives in Hawthorne, Nevada, a 1 hour drive from the nearest hospital. Well, now, I mean, that 1 hour drive was a 3 days journey. That man's dead, right? But a 1 hour drive, he might actually live now. And things, of that nature. But of course, Rockefeller, again, somebody who's very evil. In fact, he's somebody who also based his business practices on the self-same thing that Adolf Hitler based his political practices on, which was Darwinism, social Darwinism, right? And then the third example that I could give is Alexander the Great's conquests, which I've only thought of today. Alexander the Great's conquest created, and Genghis Khan's conquest as well, created immense prosperity, created a unification in peoples because they were all able to speak the same language, have the same government, use the same currency, all this kind of stuff, right? And yet, Alexander the Great committed genocide, frankly. He enslaved people, he raped women and slaughtered children, and he did so because he thought he was really cool. You know what I mean? And the point in all those examples being, right, okay, so human flourishing cannot ground morality because the things that increase human flourishing are very often not moral things. And you have to kind of sit here and define, okay, what exactly is human flourishing? Also, why just human? Is it human flourishing or conscious flourishing, which would include animal arguments now, and so on and so forth. All of that being said, though, I want to pass this on to our brother Jonathan because he's jumped in. Shalom again, and thank you for being here.
No problem. Sorry, I just got off. I was doing some training sessions tonight. So I did not see the debate with Samuel, so I do want to make that known. I was planning on, but with my wife pregnant and all for our fourth child, I kind of picked up some computer programming training hours after work so I can train some people, but definitely welcome. So are we talking about more the problem of evil, or I'm sorry, I'm just like lost on the concept.
Basically, yeah, that was the debate thesis was phrased, does evil disprove the Christian God? But of course, that is really just another way to phrase the problem of evil when you boil it down.
Yeah, I'd have to say I like the way you tackle these kind of debates. It's like kind of like in the slavery thing too. It's like you're willing to own, not like tiptoe through the tulips. You just like are straight with the concepts from the Bible in a way that's honest and or more straightforward, I guess you could say. And because I think people often lose track of that God is a judge and they want to defend God's being a good guy or whatever, and so they sometimes mistakenly will argue a little bit not dishonestly necessarily, but maybe not looking at all the factors or whatever, and so it gets a little bit sketchy. And so, like when I brought up the idea that like you can like Plantinga's argument, like you could look at that like that's not really even necessary to have to go there, making God moral or whatever, or like assuming he has morally sufficient reasons. Of course he does, right? So I don't even necessarily prefer that way of going about it, but it does make sense, like a free will theodicy type argument. So,
Well, funny enough, actually, one of the people who convinced me that such a thing was actually possible, meaning that the fundamentalist positions could actually be defended and that people would actually appreciate it, was Jonathan Sheffield, actually, because you, sir, as Jamie may or may not know, have been a defender of the text of Scripture in ways that even the most conservative scholars seem scared to. Right. In fact, you've gone after James White, who most people would agree is fundamentalist, and yet he will admit quote unquote things which, of course, create huge problems for the Christian faith. And with that, since unless you didn't want to talk problem of evil,
we could talk problem of evil. I think it's. I mean, it's. I think you gave a really good description of it, especially with the campaigns of Alexander, what that brought about. Obviously, it was part of God's will. Obviously, when we look at Ezekiel and what he did at Tyre, even in some of your conversations on the Canaanites, from my view, obviously, with Judaism and with Christianity, and what you see God doing, from a perspective of, the area has to be consecrated. We got to, clean and consecrate the area. But what God is not only testifying to what his holiness requires, but he's also creating an environment where we're getting these pagan views out of our culture. So obviously, when we look at the evil or the dread decrees of God, and when we look at the Canaanites or we look at Tyre, obviously there were practices that were among the Canaanite people that God did not want influencing the Jewish people because it would lead them astray into that. So when we look at the both Greek and Roman civilizations eventually giving up those pagan type of practices and accepting the Christian worldview, when we look at these kind of dread decisions of God and eliminate the Canaanites and what he's done throughout history, it is to bring about a more stable culture, or to kind of weed out all these practices that even the Greeks themselves saw as a problem within their societies. I mean, Aristophanes was really big on, looking at some of the moral problems in their societies, and even with you bringing up abortion, when we talk about the Greek culture, especially with the Canaanites and the Phoenicians bringing over those practices into their society. When we look about kids, the Spartans threw away their kids and abandoned them.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the morality or the Christian worldview that comes out, those ancient civilizations, adopted the Christian worldview a lot because they were trying to get away from those pagan practices. So a lot of those dread decisions of God was to bring about a better moral fabric within the Hebrew constitution.
Well, and of course, is very true. And another thing I would point out, kind of with that too, is that one of the interesting things that you end up finding in the Bible, is God he never. First off, he never does something without warning, and he also never does something without giving ample opportunity for the opposing group to turn, right? And which is of course interesting in and of itself, because God, knowing all things, knows who's going to turn and knows who's not. But you know, you look at, for example, like Moses. This has been one of my favorite examples recently, just because I've been talking a lot about it, you know, with it being Passover week and having the recent debate with Jim Majors and all this other kind of stuff. I've actually even taken to writing a book on it, fun fact. So hopefully I'll be having a book on Moses mythicism coming out here soon.
Cool.
Yeah, no, that'll be good, because I definitely want to get with you offline to kind of go over some of those arguments as well. Just because I know myself, Jim, Dr. Josh, and Dr. Stephen Boyce, we're going to be having a 2-on-2 on Daniel. But and as I start moving into a defense of the Old Testament, it'll make for a good discussion. So I have a lot of probably some useful information to share with you.
Say Daniel, the book of Daniel.
Yeah, so we're going to be discussing the book of Daniel primarily from the dating and authorship perspective.
Cool. That needs
yeah.
to be talked about more, I think, and it's something that I'm like kind of like something I bring up every once in a while to people that have channels or whatever. Like, no one ever talks about Daniel, and I'm not sure why. It seems like it's the most important, you know.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's fascinating, and let me tell you, I've been doing a lot of research, because most of the stuff I do is primarily on the New Testament side, but I have for probably the longest time wanted to really put together and you know, bro, that I've done, you know, kind of a unique style or approach that's a little different in defending a lot of my thesis on the New Testament.
The pop culture animations.
Yeah. So, but with Daniel, and I think you're right, Jamie, there's not enough out there on there. And I think the narrative is being controlled from a different perspective. So, hopefully in 3 weeks, I'll be, hopefully I can present the argument in a much different light. I think there's been a lot that has not really been touched upon that gives credence and presents, you know, really good evidence in support of the early dating and authorship. There are things that are not touched on, you know, from a Christian side that I think would really get the other side to really question and have to really dig in to explain away, which testifies to Daniel. But yeah, you're right.
Can you give us a tidbit?
Oh, I'm gonna hold off some of my arguments. But let me tell you, Jamie, April 23rd on Modern Day Debate, and I think Explain Apologetics. And then we do have something special coming up even after that, which we're probably Dr. Carrier on the subject as well. So it's going to make for a really good, I think, April 23rd, and then we have some other stuff that we're going to do with Daniel. But I don't want to give away my arguments.
That's good.
Yeah,
I'll be putting the word out for you.
Yeah,
sure.
No, thanks. It's going to be good. I think from the standpoint of, you know, there. Yeah, I don't want to give too much away, but it's going to be a new argument. Some of the same evidence, but much different. It's going to be presented in a much different light. Dr. Stephen Boyce and I have been talking a lot, doing a lot of outlining, getting all the research. I've already been working on this subject since January. So it's going to present Daniel and present the evidence in a new way. And I'm ready for you to see it too, bro. It's going to be something so different, because I've wanted to get into the Old Testament, because I think while we do a pretty decent job on some of the Christian apologetics, and not to take away, but I think there's a lot more that can be added to the conversation from a historical standpoint that is not discussed. which gives incredible weight to the early dating of Daniel that they don't really touch upon. So just like in all my debates, it's very historical. I bring out lots of resources or sources from the times to provide evidence for the position. So it's going to make for a good discussion. I'll kind of leave it at that.
Well, and let me just point out really quick, yeah, I don't talk up Jonathan's work as much as I do to bloviate. I mean, I have lots of friends here, right? I don't talk up necessarily all of them the same way. There is, and this is to your point, Jamie, there is a massive deficiency in Christian apologetics when it comes to most topics. Most guys, they'll center around general, does God exist stuff like William Lane Craig. They'll center around resurrection stuff like Michael Licona, or they'll center around creation stuff, which we don't even all agree on necessarily, like Kent Hovind and AIG, right? But when it comes to Moses, when it comes to the Old Testament, when it comes to who wrote the Gospels, right, and when, and this kind of stuff, this is something that is terribly deficient, and what we're seeing from the work that you put out, John, is really a reaction to that in a way that I think, I mean, I don't mean to put it, in too, I guess, bold of terms, but if the Lord tarries 1,000 years from now, I have a feeling that this will be the same stuff that people who are like, the way that people are looking now at, like, oh, well, remember when Irenaeus defended the faith against the large majority of other people, and remember when Justin Martyr defended the faith against this large majority of people, and remember when Augustine, you know what I mean, and all that. Although I'm not a huge fan of Augustine, to be fair, but the point just being, right, like, this is literally something that doesn't exist elsewhere. And to my audience too, let me say that as well. If you haven't checked out Jonathan's channel, please do so, because these defenses, they truly don't exist elsewhere, with the exception of very minute cases that are all seemingly emerging now. And I think it's important because, like when we, just as an example with the Daniel, since we're talking about that, right? When you concede that maybe Daniel is written late, or maybe I just don't care, then what you're saying is, I don't care if Daniel's prophecies are correct, which means what you're saying is, I don't care if the thing that proves Daniel is legit is correct, which means what you're saying is, I don't care if Daniel's legit, right? It's a collection of cool stories at that point that maybe have some esoteric value philosophically or something like that, right? And they might be good for your life and give you hope and stuff, but like, that's not the Christian faith, right? The Christian faith is based in reality. And
yeah, Daniel's kind of an important one. It's the prophecy that we need to have and know to really show Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah, it's a great work. So much there, and I think, and I think this is why we see so much attack on it. I mean, not only now, but in the ancient world as well, with Profer. I think that, Profer was not. I mean, he was one of the more sophisticated philosophers of the time. He wasn't the. I know some try to present him in a kind of, he just believed in all these gods, and if you ever read his Aeneids, I mean, just a brilliant philosopher, and obviously the Neo-Platonic views would not really support the materialism that's in the Old and New Testament. But I think with the works of the Jews had a big influence upon the Greek-speaking world, especially after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and the Greeks really got exposed to Judaism, and you have the God-fearers, and with Profer obviously being supposedly a Christian convert, or he was a Christian and then converted. I think he realized what was happening to Greek philosophy, and a lot of the Greeks were coming over and converting. I mean, they were converting over in Hellenistic times as well with the God-fearers. So, and a lot of that has to do with the Jewish scriptures. That's why there was a need to, by Ptolemy II, to reach out and ask for the Jewish scriptures to be brought to the Library of Alexander, because they really wanted to understand a lot about who the Jews were. And I think when you see the God-fearers coming over, and this movement over to Judaism among the Greeks, a lot of that has to do with the Jewish scriptures that they were being exposed to. Because remember, the Septuagint, it served a purpose not only for the Jews, but obviously the God-fearers as well, or the Greeks coming over into Judaism.
Really quick, I just want to acknowledge here, because this was something I guess I missed earlier in the conversation. This Little Apologetics, by the way, shalom, and thank you for being here, Little Apologetics. What if we consider lesser domestic examples that are completely random and horrendous? Because it seems to me the big events cause human flourishing, but lesser examples do not at all. That's a good point. I just wanted to address that just because I thought it was a good point. I don't want to completely derail. Unfortunately, I did miss it, and so we won't talk too much about it. So I apologize for that, Little Apologetics. But that is a decent point. It seems like only big evils actually have caused human flourishing. Small evils don't tend to do so. But anyway.
If you look at Joseph being the small evil that befell Joseph by his brothers throwing him into the pit, it was kind of a small one, but it brought about big change and preservation for the people of Israel. So little things brought about big consequences in terms of the history of the Jewish people.
I have a question about
that. Go ahead, Jamie. Are you going to say something?
Jamie, you still there?
Sorry about that. I was being called. Yeah, I was going to ask. Yeah, sorry about that. I was going to ask you guys if, like when it says in the scripture, like he says God meant it for good, you guys meant it for evil.
Yes.
Like with Joseph. Now, I think there's like two ways you can read that. Do you tend to look at it more like God? I mean, in a sense, God, if he has exhaustive foreknowledge, knows everything that's going to happen. But it seems though when it differentiates people's intentions, and if you don't take that as being, say, like if you don't take determinism to be the case or whatever, I'm not sure how you guys feel on that. But I mean, do we look at it like God caused those events, or that he's making good from what people are doing? So is he like repairing it, or is it all good from the beginning, or whatever, how you would say that? What do you think? Does that even make sense?
No, that does. And I know it kind of, I mean, obviously, depending on your theological position, there's different ways to answer it. Obviously, if you look at that, God brought about that. Now, obviously, the intention, like you talked to, and as is kind of illustrated in the Old Testament, that obviously the brothers who threw Joseph in the pit, their purpose and intentions came from an evil place. But obviously, the work of God in bringing about that event, while the people doing the actions had evil purpose and there was no purpose in it, God used those means, the evil means, that being his brothers, as a means to bring about the preservation of the people of Israel. So the people themselves did not have any good intentions in anything that they did, but God used those evil means or instruments as a way to bring about something good. So those evil means brought about a purpose for the Jewish people.
Yeah, I didn't mean to make it about soteriology or anything, or like, about, those different positions. But I mean, even from, say like a non-reform position, you could look at that either way, I think. But yeah, it's awesome either way,
Yeah, no, how he brings about the good purpose, or the end means kind of the means justifies the end in a sense, but he sort of using those instruments or means to bring about his plan. So
Yeah, and I think I would also kind of my view honestly is a little deterministic in a way. I do think God has in his power managed to create a world where he is both the author, meaning that he is determining things by his pen, and also we have free will in him doing it. I know that's typically just referred to as compatibilism, but I like to kind of explain it out just because I think that I don't know. I don't think most people know what compatibilism is. I didn't even actually until Skylar Fiction told me, believe it or not, like a month ago, and yet I believe it, right? But
yeah, I think that's right. In a sense, that is kind of the case, because we know God, is authoring his story. I like that analogy.
Well, and I also kind of think too, we do have examples in the Bible where and I'm a very big fan of James White, the Reformed Baptist apologist, right? I quote him frequently on this program. He has very often asked the question, all right, Judas and Barnabas, excuse me, the crowd at Barabbas and Pontius Pilate, and all these other people, the guy who actually ended up making the decision to nail Caiaphas and Ananias, all these guys who made all these evil decisions, did they have the choice to do otherwise? And it's kind of a weird question, because on one end, you think, of course, right? Of course, Judas had the right to do otherwise. If he didn't, he'd be like an automaton, and there really wouldn't be any ability to like judge somebody for being an automaton, right? But yet on another end, I mean, is that actually true? That sounds like it's obvious, but is it really true? Does Judas actually have the, because then, I mean, if Judas doesn't betray Jesus, there's no salvation, right? At least, I don't know. And that's where people get into like best of all possible worlds and middle knowledge and stuff like that. And those are just, I don't know. Those are kind of weird to me in a way, like I don't know. Cause even then, I start to go back a little bit, right? Because like if somebody asked me the question, does God know what would happen if you made the decision contrary to the one you did actually make? I do think the answer is yes. And technically that's kind of Molinism. But I mean, I guess the point, even is just that it's complicated and I don't even necessarily have everything figured out really, but there is, I think, that example to really like struggle with, right? Could Judas have actually said no and not betrayed Jesus? Could Pilate have actually allowed Jesus to be freed? Put another way, even, could what's his name? Tiglath-Pileser III, when he was doing evil things to Israel in judgment of them, could he have not done those evil things to Israel? Or was, would God have used another instrument of wrath? Or did it have to be Tiglath-Pileser III, right? I don't know. They're interesting questions, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of think that, or I would prefer to affirm that in some sense they could have done otherwise. But on another hand, I feel like we should affirm that there's only one, round of going through time and history. And so if God has perfect foreknowledge, in a sense, there is a way he could have done otherwise in that regard. So it's kind of like God's has exhaustive foreknowledge, perhaps, so he knows what we will do, but that doesn't necessarily force us or cause us to do it. And if we were to do otherwise, which possibly maybe, that is a thing that's, a possibility. But if it were the outcome of the other way, God would have known that. So I kind of tend to look at it like that. But it is it just like depends on what angle you're coming at it from.
Yeah, I mean, I know Luther in his debate against Erasmus, he goes over that point in the bondage of the will. Did Judas Iscariot have the ability? He went to his ability to change his decision, in a sense, overturning the will of God. So Luther does an excellent discussion on that. Obviously, he's coming from his position as well. I mean, a really great read and discussion on the subject. In the same way, and Moses presented the word of God to, Pharaoh. Could he have relented, or is it the word of God when it came before? He hardened his heart against it and portrayed. So it's because once again, if Ramsey said, "No, you know what? We're going to treat you guys. They never leave Egypt. They don't go to Jerusalem. What does that bring about?" So a lot of these things bring about, who the Jews were, where they end up going, their histories, their captivities, eventually leading to Christ. So, but no, it's good discussions to have.
Well, and I think in the end, what I think it does kind of boil down to is, there, kind of like I said earlier, there has to be, I think, in some way, a combination of God has written this his own end, and where there is a predetermination in that sense, but also he seems to have been able to do so with free creatures. It's almost like, I almost kind of put it like, I wonder if maybe Judas, did he literally have the ability to not actually betray Jesus? I think the answer might be yes, but was it in his nature? Maybe would be a question to ask, right? And maybe I think the answer there would probably be no, and maybe the answer really is that it's not in any man's nature, right?
Well, yeah, and I think you're right on that. Cause I was going to bring that up too about what's within the nature, because obviously, what he did was free in the sense he was freely committing the act of betrayal, so that came freely from him. But was it within his nature to do otherwise? Same thing with Ramses. Was it within his nature to recognize the God of Israel and succumb to him? And there, I would say no. The word of God was presented to Ramses, and he hardened his heart against it. Obviously, Judas, what he did was a free act of sin, but it was within his nature. So could he have acted contrary to his nature? That's where I'd probably say no.
Hey, Jonathan, I think you might have given away your position on the Exodus.
Possibly. Well, that's not going to really be covered so much in Daniel. So,
right on.
But no, the Exodus is really good. I never mind talking about the history of Exodus. It's a beautiful story. I remember going through Josephus quite a bit on that topic, and him going to a lot of the ancient Greek writers in support of the Exodus story. Not to mention all the other historians of the time that wrote on the area and the Jews. yeah, there's a lot of history or a lot of writings from non-Jewish sources on that particular event.
Did you catch CJ's thing this morning where he's talking about his debate with Jim Majors and on the SBA channel?
No, I didn't. I did listen to your opening statement, CJ. So I think you did really well on that. I sometimes, and even though I'm going to bring in some additional perspective in the Daniel debate, I think when we start going to some of the other ancient sources in addition with it. We can show a very consistent history with what's described, in the Torah. It's, even though a lot of times they will say, well, you can't be sure. Well, yeah, we can't be sure of anything, but, you can't rule it out. I mean, that testimony that we're getting from Manetho, that's writing, which seems very consistent with the Jews that he calls shepherds out of Egypt, and they went into the other area, and he mentions their sacred books. You look at that history, and it's like, well, yeah, you could debate and say, well, maybe that wasn't the Jews, but it's consistent with what the book of Exodus says, so you can't rule it out based on that. But I didn't get to see this morning. I was up at 7. I wanted to take a look at it. But CJ, definitely after the Daniel debate, if you want to do an after party, that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm down actually. Let's see. The 23rd is going to
Friday.
be a Friday. I might be working on that day. So I might not be able to. Of course, that even depends, I guess, because sometimes these debates they start at sometimes 6, go on 2 hours. That's 8.
Well, yeah, this one's going to be 8 p.m. Central Time, so that's my time. So it's probably going to be done at 10:30 Central Time.
Yeah, I'll definitely be able to make that then, actually, because that's 9:30 my time. I'll be off work by then. So yeah, actually, we should just kind of go ahead and assume that'll happen then, because that'll be cool. I'll be listening to that. I'll be able to listen to the debate at work, so I'm allowed to listen to podcasts and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's going to be it's going to be quite interesting. It's a different approach than what is common out there in Christian apologetics. So I think even though I still have a lot more to organize and put together, it's going to come from it's going to be very interesting. It's going to emphasize some points that haven't really been touched on in the subject. I'm like, that's like the holy grail right there. I don't understand why it's not being talked about as much. So
I'm so happy to hear that, man. That's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
MDD,
So
right?
What's that?
On MDD, on Modern Day Debate.
Yeah, it's going to be on Modern Day Debate, and I think it's going to be co-hosted with Explain Apologetics. But we're going to have that, and it's whether you listen to Mike Winger, and there's a lot of people that do good stuff on it. I think there's a lot that's not being talked about in the debate, and I think. And CJ, you know this from seeing my debates with like Airman and Carrier. I bring it from a different angle. With Carrier, when we talked about the resurrection and we had that debate, it's why weren't the rulers of the Roman Empire able to refute the resurrection of Jesus? So
that's where I recognize you from. I think I saw that debate.
Yeah,
I knew I recognized your name. I know I knew who you were. I just couldn't put my finger on it.
Yeah, so that one was really good because we had the debate on his blog first to go over opening statements and counter and rebuttals. So we were able to research the subjects and get back on some of the content, and then we were able to have our closing arguments and have our discussion on air. So it really made for a really good discussion from a different perspective, because now you have an independent agency outside Christianity that was investigating the claims of Christianity that was being spread throughout their empire, and eventually they converted. So that made for a much different discussion on the resurrection. That's typically, I do feel like Christians play a lot of defense on that subject, and here was a way that we went on the offense with a different polemic on the issue, and Carrie had to play a lot more defense trying to defend his position.
That's awesome. Can I ask one more quick question, and I'll
Oh
stop
yeah, no,
taking over your show, CJ? I wanted to know what you guys thought of. Hi, John. I just wanted to know what you guys made of the argument, since you're a conservative, apparently, with the idea that, and it was an IP's video too on the Exodus. Whether or not you saw that doesn't matter, I guess. But the idea that, okay, so I'm like super conservative in most of my views, so, but I've
and
kind
I
of
am too.
okay, yeah, I've come to accept this idea that it's okay, or it's reasonable to say, for instance, if you're going to take the 1400 dates, in the 14 or the 15th or whatever, the 1440s or 50s or whatever, for the Exodus, that the way you explain the idea of the text mentioning Ramses, let's say, could be explained as being an updated place name when the text was copied, perhaps for the audience to be able to recognize which area in geography was being mentioned in their common name.
Yeah, a lot of things are brought up to date when people are, I mean, especially with the Old Testament, especially with like Nehemiah. I mean, even today, things are brought up to date so people can refer to what they're used to. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about like the Thracians and all these, people don't know what that is today, but that's why even in our literature, we don't call things really Persia anymore. It's Iran, so a lot of things are brought up to date, so the audience is familiar with the content.
So you find that reasonable in the scripture, because I say, isn't Ramses mentioned as like a city or something?
Yeah, and
even
I mean,
if it's in the scripture.
Yeah, remember, we don't have the copy from the there was a lot of I'm not saying editing, but we know the Greeks were very interested in the Old Testament scriptures, and they obviously wanted it translated in Greek. Things could have been brought up to date or modernized in there to account for those names. So let's see.
Yeah, because I was initially like kind of held back on that, because probably like my uber, conservative teaching as I grew up or whatever. But I've come to think that seems totally, acceptable, I guess.
Yeah, I think what you like, when I read Josephus, remember, he's defending the antiquity of the Jews against the Greeks, who were challenging the notion that the Jewish people had any ancient lineage back in that time. And so Josephus is defending that particular treatise in the first century against those nations when he came out with his publication. So obviously, he realized that a lot of people were already spreading false lies against the Jews especially in the Jewish laws, in the Jewish war. So he wanted to give, an exact account or a really good historiographic narrative on who the Jewish people were, their ancient lineage, which was attacked by the kind of Hellenistic philosophy, that, the Jews were never really there. So those arguments were being made in the first century too. And so Josephus is defending his thesis, and he's going to not only the ancient Greek historians, but also the barbarian ones as well, those outside the Hellenistic culture, um, principally, the Phoenician and the Chaldean histories, because remember, the Jews were in Jerusalem. They weren't coastal cities like Phoenicia and Egypt, Tyre. When you look at all these maritime countries where they were able to interact with each other so much because of trade and commerce, the Jews are up in the mountains in Judea, and so they're not a coastal or maritime type country. So their closest neighbors, obviously, the Phoenicians and the Egyptians, and that's where a lot of the confirmation history comes out of. Even though we do have Greek historians, Josephus uses Manetho, Becerus to speak of the times of Noah, and Moses. So there's a lot of histories from that time that support the antiquity of the Jewish people, and that's what Josephus was specifically defending to the Greek-speaking world, who was basically making the argument that, yeah, you guys aren't as old as you think you are. But Josephus was bringing his principal witnesses to show that not only the Chaldean and the Egyptian histories and the Phoenician histories really speak to the Jewish people, because they were the closest people to the Jews, but the Greeks speak of who we are as well. So he makes a tremendous case for the antiquity of the Jews.
Well, and I think another thing I would want to kind of point out briefly too is, when we're looking at a lot of these different situations. So, like, first off, to get to the initial question you had asked, Jamie, about the city Ramses, right? I think it is rather clear that somebody edited the Torah after Moses, because it's not just Ramses, but also somebody obviously wrote his death in there. A lot of times I've made the argument that it could be him because he is a prophet, and I still stand by that. But also, I think we do need to, of course, look at the fact that they talk about, like, he they didn't know where his body was buried and stuff like that. That just seems like an odd thing to add if you're the one being prophetic about it. I also think the fact that it's written in third person is an indicator to that, and also there's certain things that are added there that Moses just probably didn't write himself. Like, for example, Moses was meeker than all men. That's probably something that somebody added earlier or later, rather. And so what I think is probably the case is that the whole of the Torah, the core of the Torah was written by Moses at the time that it was written by him, right? Sometime around the 1400s BC. And there was probably another one of these spirit-led redactors and collectors who sort of updated it at some point in time, which, in my opinion, it seems like there could only be two, because the only people who, it seems to me, were doing something similar to that were Samuel and Ezra. And I think Samuel probably would make a little bit more sense. I think, Jonathan was just letting us know he had to jump off. So thank you very much for being with us, by the way, brother, and Godspeed and whatever it is.
Very informative. That was great.
Say that again.
Sorry to interrupt you, man. I was just saying it was really great. That was really awesome. Very informative. what Jonathan said.
So yeah, and of course, and I guess LPP just hopped off a little bit too. Oh no, he's back. At any rate, though, so I do think there is evidence to suggest that we have that somebody had edited at some point the Torah that Moses had written, and that that's probably the explanation for a few of the other things. And the reason I think it makes more sense for it to be Samuel than it does for it to be Ezra is because I don't know that calling Avaris Ramses would have meant much to the people of Ezra's time. It seems to me that it was pretty well like destroyed at that point or abandoned by the time that Ezra would be living.
Yeah, I agreed with that too. What the things you were mentioning, I hadn't considered the potential ones that would have been the adding the little things or whatever. I'd heard the things you mentioned, some of the things you mentioned, but I hadn't heard about or even considered who it might have been, which is probably a good question to ask. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and of course, I could totally be wrong on that too. The main reason why I don't necessarily think I am is just because we do have examples of that happening, right? Like just as one of the better examples, I think. When we have in certain places, the hill that Christ is crucified on is called Golgotha, and in other places it's called Calvary, right? They both mean the same thing, and these people are speaking to different audiences, so they're using a different term, right? And so I think when, writing the, 16th, 17th, whatever translation of the scroll, eventually it just became prudent for people to say, okay, well, the Jews, we can't say the Jews built Avaris because they did, but that's not, nobody knows what that means. So we'll say Ramses, right? Because it's the same city. Just like when we say the Dutch founded New York, and it's like, well, that's true, but it was New Amsterdam at the time. You know what I mean?
Makes sense to me.
I bet if we did a poll, less than 20% of Americans would know New Amsterdam was the original name of New York.
I got to be honest with you. I think 20% is even pushing it.
Yep.
Americans are just, unfortunately, just woefully uninformed, it appears. Real quick, I do want to say, just because I haven't acknowledged you yet, Shalom LPP, thank you for being here.
Oh, of course, man. I was enjoying listening to y'all's convo. So you're doing a debate on Daniel on SJ's channel?
No, so Jonathan Sheffield is doing a debate with Josh Bowen and Jim Majors, and he's got Stephen Boyce is going to be with him. They're going to do a tag team modern day debate on Daniel. So what we were talking about on SJ's is I went over there earlier today to talk about my debate with Jim Majors, and actually he ended up coming on too, so we ended up having another discussion on it. The one about
nice, but that was interesting. I'll check that out.
Yeah, he there's some interesting things that he ended up, I think, kind of, revealing that I don't know. I think it's interesting to see. I would like to know how he came to some of these conclusions. Like, for example, he said that he didn't think any of the Bible was actually pre-exilic. Some of it would be written during the exile. Some of it would be post-exilic, but he didn't think any of it was pre-exilic. And that's an interesting claim, in my opinion, because I think it's been fairly well established that Hosea, that Amos, that Isaiah are all written at about the times that they were claimed to. In fact, at least in the case of Amos and Hosea, I think most scholars just outright buy the biblical claim that Amos and Hosea are the scribes of those books. And the Deuteronomist history, most people usually say that was around Josiah's time during his reforms, which is pre-exilic. And then, of course, also there's the fact that, if you have a documentary hypothesis, then you have pre-existing traditions, and those would obviously be pre-exilic. And the reason I even bring it up is just because I think that it is kind of an example of the self-same thing that we see all the time in Christ mythicism, but that we wouldn't notice as much in Moses mythicism because we don't tend to challenge it, which is that you kind of end up building your evidence on other evidence that isn't actually there.
Yeah, almost out of necessity for you, ultimately for the position that you're just, incredulous or whatever towards the idea of God or the Bible. I mean, it feels that way anyway sometimes. Like it's a necessity to take a piss.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely on that. And I think case in point was the point that Jonathan was making a little while ago in regards to the Roman Empire, in regards to the resurrection. And I've thought about, other people have brought that up. I've thought about that many times. Like, are you honestly telling me that the Roman Empire was unable to put down this concept and that ultimately it emerged victorious with Constantine, right? I mean, like in regards to Constantine, right? Like you're telling me that they couldn't put this down. There was this little deal here. They
this made up story that people were just peddling to get the get the money or whatever. Who knows what they think? But I mean, yeah, it's a good point.
And I was talking about this the other day, and I forget where, but you have to think about, and then this goes back to the whole premise of just the existence of Jesus Christ, right? In modern era, right? Well, really for over 1,000. Well, at this point, well over 1,000 years, but the literal calendar of the world has been demarcated by the existence of Jesus Christ. And it's something that we kind of take for granted in our just day-to-day life, right? Like we live in AD 2021, right? Like,
right.
We kind of take this for granted, but it's in the year of our Lord 2021. And people just kind of gloss that over in regards to, well, did Jesus even exist? Like, it seems to me that I'm not saying that's like direct evidence. I'm just saying, like, you don't recognize the significance of this entire point that's being made here in terms of like the question of if he even existed. I mean, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And on top of that, I think another thing that I've always kind of wanted to point out is there is really no religion that has had a similar situation to the Christian one as far as its rise, right? So like you look at, like, for example, Zoroaster, right? If the story of Zoroaster is correct, well, he was actually directly endorsed by the king, and he was an advisor to the king. And regardless of if that story is correct or not, we do know that the kings of Persia did actually have Zoroastrian priests and stuff like that, right? So the religion itself, whether or not Zoroaster was definitely endorsed by the kings. You look at Confucius, same thing, right? You look at somebody like Lao Tzu or Buddha, not necessarily the same thing, but they didn't ever have to deal with persecution. They sort of just were left to their own devices, right? But when you look at Christianity has to survive direct persecution from its immediate area, namely the Jews, right? And then it also has to survive persecution from the greater area, namely the Roman Empire. And then to make matters worse, as it turns out, the rest of the people outside of the Roman Empire aren't too fond of it either, right? The barbarians and the Hindus and the people up in Rus, which is former Russia, right? And all those other kinds of places. I mean, Thomas was, according to tradition, skinned alive in India for preaching there. The Apostle Thomas, I mean. And the point being, I don't know of a single other faith that survived in that way and actually went on to become profitable. In fact, one that immediately comes to mind is and I'll pass it real quick after this, the cult of Mazdak in the I think 500s BC, if I'm remembering that correctly. It might have been 500s AD, but it's like this socialist cult, basically, where everybody followed this prophet Mazdak, who basically taught that we all need to be a bunch of freaking commies. Honestly, he's like a hippie, and and he was put under persecution, and then it was over. They stamped it out. You know what I mean? And
I think case in point, to extenuate what you're talking about there. I mean, the only other religion I would say that's had let's just be blunt, it's the number 2, right, is Islam. However, and it kind of goes back to your point about Buddhism and whatnot, of either it was endorsed, Zoroastrianism endorsed by the king or the emperors or whatever, or it was crushed, or it rose by what mechanism? The sword. And I would say that's probably one of the single greatest lines of demarcation between the initial growth. I'm not going to claim that the Catholic Church was not doing their thing and different quote unquote Christian empires, right? But I'm talking about like the actual rise of it. Let's say the first 400 years, right, of Christianity, they were being executed, right, left and right. And to my knowledge, I'm sure there were some like microcosms of this, but to my knowledge, there was nothing like what Muhammad did, for example, and the putting together of armies and then ultimately conquering through the sword and through intimidation and conquering of cities and such. I mean, it's a polar opposite in terms of the rise of the two.
Yeah, it is interesting too. When you look at the idea of martyrdom, I've often made the comment before that martyrs don't really truly exist in the Christian way outside of Christianity. And what I mean by that is eyewitnesses dying for what they claimed to witness without actual gain in the physical. And people often bring up Islam because there's tons and tons and tons of martyrs in Islam from Muhammad's time. And it's really funny because this is, to your point, LPP, it's always like, okay, yeah, but those guys they're not, I mean, to call the guy who breaks into your house, who then got his head blown off because he broke into your house, a martyr, is kind of weird language, right?
It's kind of a perversion.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're not talking about the same thing here. That's not Paul getting his head chopped off simply for preaching the gospel, right? This guy came in, he wanted to take your wife, he wanted to take your stuff, force you to convert, and you happen to be lucky enough or blessed enough or skilled enough or whatever it is to kill him first. Like, if that's a martyr, then I'm a woman, I guess. You know what I mean?
Well, and you kind of extenuate your point there, like at least I'll put it in the modern era context. If you're considered a martyr for going to a music concert with a bomb and blowing yourself and dozens, if not hundreds of other people up, and that classifies you as a martyr rather than a murderer.
Yeah, because you want to hate the culture.
Right. Something is bizarre, right? Because to your point, CJ, on the flip side, I'm not saying there's not the outliers to this, but I'm talking about the commonalities, right? On the flip side, the Christian is sacrificing themselves to save another, or being willing to sacrifice their own life, right?
Right.
It's like, so not to kill somebody else, right? Like,
exactly.
It's like, no, I will willfully surrender. I'm not going to fight you, and I'm going to allow you. I'm going to surrender and put my life. I mean, think about all the Book of Martyrs, for example. I mean, I remember reading that portion of that when I was probably 14 or 15.
Foxes.
And I remember reading the one where they were talking about how they would create an incision, pull out a portion of your guts, nail it to a wall, and then poke you with a hot iron to force you to disembowel yourself unless you recanted. And I'm just like, number one, when you really, there are, as you all know, there was even, I mean, there's all sorts of different, just incredibly horrific ways that they did this. But just that one is an example, right? I sat there, and I've done it many times since then. But I remember when I was, 14, 15 years old, sitting there contemplating that premise, right? And just asking myself the question of, in the moment of truth, would I have had the guts is the wrong word, the courage and the faith, right, to have not recanted? It's like it's a legitimate question, right? Like, you're in a freaking dungeon, you had your stomach's been cut open, and your guts are hanging out, and they're nailing it to the wall and being like, okay, listen, so I'm either going to keep jabbing you with this scalding hot iron, and you're going to disembowel yourself and die, or you recant. You're blasphemy. I mean, we don't think about that in the modern era, right? I mean, there's some outliers going on now, some of the different terror groups and stuff killing people, but that's not the commonality anymore, at least not in Western civilization.
Yeah, well, and it's almost like you could almost wrap the whole thing up in a single example, right? A guy goes into a room and says, goes into a church room and says, if you don't recant Christianity, I'm going to blow you and your congregation up. And the pastor says, I cannot. And so he blows everybody up. Both of those guys are considered martyrs in their religion. We're obviously not talking about the same thing at that point, right? If in the same situation, the killer and the killed are considered martyrs in each of their respective faiths, then obviously these faiths are addressing different things. And to your point, John, when we're talking about the Christian martyrs, I mean, being blown up is an easy one, right? Like, thank God for the guy who was martyred in the Christian faith only by being blown up by a suicide bomber, because what the Romans would do, what the Indians would do, by Indians, I mean East Indian, by the way, not Native Americans, what a lot of the barbarian people would do. I mean, it's just horrific.
I mean, case in point, what ISIS was doing in a couple years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, putting people in cages and burning them alive. I mean, it's the case in point. I mean, that's what I was kind of saying in context of Western civilization, right? Like, there's still some of that barbarity happening, and it's coming, it's growing, actually. Obviously we all know it's inevitable to return, but who knows, it may end up surpassing the barbarity of the Dark Ages and before. Who knows? Wouldn't be surprised me with the technology and the knowledge that's now in hand. Who knows what kind of bizarre actions will be taken? But yeah, that's a great point you made, TJ. It creates the very apparent dichotomy between the two, for sure.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And really quick, I want to, just because people often think like, oh, you Christians have this persecution complex and all that. First off, if you're a Christian, you do just need to understand that the Lord literally promised you persecution, and the end of days is promised to be getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. I personally am pre-trib rapture, but regardless, there's going to be an awful lot of persecution before that rapture. And I would point out that if you weren't willing to go through a post-trib to make it to a post-trib rapture, you're not going to be the person who's taken in a pre-trib rapture. So it doesn't really matter anyways. But also, and I understand people might have a problem with me saying this kind of thing, but I think it's true. I think we've been shown enough evidence to support this kind of thing. There are plenty of the atheist speakers that we even talk to and have conversation and debate with, who would absolutely, if they had their way, love to see us imprisoned. I don't say that lightly. I don't say that in a way that I feel is slanderous. But there are plenty of people who we have, and I think, John, you probably have a couple names ringing through your head right now of people who you've had conversation and debate with here on this platform, who for sure would love to see you imprisoned for what you believe. And those guys, obviously, if they're on YouTube, they're speakers with followings. So like, it's literally that close. And I can name a couple names. I mean, I'll name at least one because I think that he's made it public at this point. The Raging Atheist has been very clear that he supports things like the doxing of people who he considers to be traitors, which at this point is any Trump supporters. He has been very clear that he supports things like forcing parents to not be able to actually make decisions for their children as far as like gender identity is concerned. He's been very clear that he thinks that you shouldn't be allowed to quote unquote indoctrinate your children, which means taking your children away from you, potentially arresting you as a child abuser, right? I mean, like this person has almost 3,000 subscribers and a large following, and Aaron Ra is him tenfold, if not more so, right? And all these other people who are, and they're clear, they're very, very clear with the way that they feel about Christians.
Well, and the irony of that, and this is kind of a case in point of the, and I don't necessarily know if I'm not accusing him, the person I'm about to mention of this, of actually being his mindset, but the naivete otherwise, is my debate the other day with Randolph. Like on his websites, he literally says that one of his purposes is to normalize atheism so that the vilified theist community, or the atheist vilifying theist community, will stop persecuting atheists. And I'm just like, I mean, I said in my opening statement when I brought it up, I'm like, I don't know what world you're living in, bro. Like,
yeah, that just blew me off my seat, man. That blew my socks off. It was so conspiratorial. I mean, he brings a really nice and friendly persona or whatever, but that sounded so conspiratorial to me. I was just I was kind of embarrassed.
Absolutely, and I'm just like, so I'm what was going through my mind. And I said this to some degree, but what was really going through my mind was just, man, do you live in some kind of alternate universe, or are you trying to be a propaganda agent to, minimize the end objective, from a communication perspective, like minimize the real end objective? Because when you think about this, if what he said was true, right, then atheism would have been eradicated or been pushed underground because until very, very recently, both in Canada and in the United States, Christianity was like at the highest point, right, of anywhere on the planet. And in terms of adoption, just you guys follow my logic there, I'm sure. Yeah. It wouldn't have happened, right? If Christians were actually running around attempting to like crush any kind of alternative thought, it would have been crushed, right? Like that's,
yeah. If it was going to do it, I think I made a comment during your debate that it's like, I tend to look at it like at least the principles of Christianity, tend to allow to tolerate atheism or whatever in a lot of ways. I mean, that's obviously not the plan of God or whatever, but I mean,
in a way it is, though. In a way it is, if I may, just because, I don't think it's coincidental that the Jewish nation and the world's different Protestant nations are the freest nations that have ever existed. I think that because the thing is, as much as God hates the flourishing of these wicked things like sin and atheism and all that, right? These people, they have the ability to choose it for themselves, and they have the information to choose it for themselves in an informed way. You know what I mean? And in a way, it's kind of scary because, people say, oh, we get more and more evidence and it just proves more and more that Christianity isn't true. But really, the exact opposite is the case. And I think I can say boldly that people who live in our generation and yet reject are going to be held to a much, much higher standard than people who did it 1,000 years ago or even 100 years ago, because
it's absolutely dead on.
Yeah, exactly. And I appreciate that
when you can Google all this information in less than 10 seconds, and then within 5 minutes can have read information that even 30 years ago would have required probably hours, if not potentially days, to acquire. You're correct. You were without excuse. And when the people that we interact with, and sometimes interact more than once, right? And then we'll pose a question to them or make a challenge. And then what do we hear? Well, I'll look into it. I'll look into it, right? And then, 2 months later, a week later, 3 months later, whatever it is, or you're on another channel and you hear them talking, right? And they go in the same rabbit hole, right? So then the next time, and the same excuse, or not the excuse, they haven't made the excuse yet. They're making the same point, right? About Christianity, whatever it is, right? And the next time you interact with them, and it's kind of like I interact with somebody, I'll call them out on it. And so, did you go and like research XYZ? Did you Google it? No, I haven't had time yet. And it's usually some variation of that. I haven't had time yet. Case in point, in my debate with Randolph, right? I don't know if you guys made it to the end of that debate. It was hilarious. I asked him if he'd actually gone and researched any of this stuff, and he said he claimed he didn't have time. And I'm like, you're an atheist activist.
Yeah,
and
literally.
Somehow you don't have time. He's like, oh, well, I'm building a studio right now. So I'm like, when was the last time you looked at this? Well, it's been a while. I'm like, so you've been being an atheist activist for freaking 20 years. He's like, well, actually longer than that. Okay, longer than 20 years. You've been an atheist activist. And you haven't gone and actually researched any of this stuff or done it on a very, very superficial level because you claim you don't have time. But you have time to do all this other stuff. You have time to have this debate and debates on a regular basis, right? And be on streams. You have time to do this, but you somehow do not have time to utilize the technology that we're referring to right now to go and access and just see, case in point if it's true or false.
That argument had been around a while too, I'd say. That came up when you suggested or asked him about if his answer to the what was it? It was the whether the argument about choosing God or Christianity for the the 50-50 split or whatever the outcome. What is that called again?
You talking about when he brought up Pascal's wager? He said he said he had researched Pascal's wager.
So, quick question. I'm just curious because I noticed his website is called Canadian Atheist, and I wanted to ask, but I never actually got around to it. Did him and Michael work together? Michael, the Canadian Atheist?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised though.
That would be interesting. Not that matters, of course. I was just curious.
What you were saying about the evidence and stuff too. I wanted to say. I mean, sometimes I'm surprised. I find myself like trying to help them almost, and I'm just like, you probably ought to take, not try to deny this, and then just go with this. If you're gonna, it's like you're just gonna deny it. It seems, and so you'd probably be better off accepting some of the stuff and then arguing against it in some other way, because you're just making yourself look ridiculous in trying to deny certain things that you haven't looked at better. And so,
in line with that, not just from an evidentiary perspective, but also from a critical thinking standpoint, right? The willful suspension of critical thinking skills and rational thought it continues to blow my mind on a daily basis. So, like 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, when I did my my calling out the clowns stream, and I went after CRISPR-Cas9. The guy is working on his PhD, okay, and he categorically denied that the whole premise of a historical science existed. Like, he's a TA. He's got a master's. He's been in research. He's currently a TA in a university working on his PhD. And he categorically denies the premise that it even exists, that historical sciences even exist. Right? Like,
yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, though, it kind of, I mean, we never actually, a lot of times we do, especially apologists, of course, because it's our job to sort of polemicize against these guys. But People very frequently don't actually think of like Frank Turek's funny little witty quip. There is no absolute truth. Well, is that true? Right? It's like, oh, ha ha ha, that's funny. But it's like that's actually like a shattering argument.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like if there is no absolute truth, that's an absolute truth, which means there is in fact absolute truth. Therefore, it can't possibly be true, right? It's a paradox.
Yeah,
and like exactly, like we sit there and we think of it like as, oh yeah, it's a funny quip, but it's like, no, that's actually like your argument just shattered, like a plate falling down. You know what I mean? And these kinds of things happen all the time. Like as an example, everybody knows Darwin's quote, right? About how can you trust his own thinking, and like it'd be like trusting the thoughts of the mind of a monkey, if there even is such a mind, right? And I of course paraphrase that terribly, but the idea being that like, okay, like if you're just this ape that happens to be slightly more advanced than the other apes, I mean, yeah, ain't a single person on the world would look at a chimpanzee and be like, yep, I trust his judgment. You know what I mean? Like, we just wouldn't do it because that's absurd. So why would you do the same for some smarter ape? It's not like you trust the chimpanzee more than you trust the lizard. You know what I mean? Just because it's smarter. They're both animals, and you wouldn't do such a thing.
Yeah,
and that's shattering.
Yeah,
I've been kind of making jokes about that exact concept in my community posts. So I'm doing some memes about that kind of thing, and this past couple weeks, and what's really been fascinating to me is the responses I get from the atheists. It's like, okay, so I did one. It was like in Evo Atheist Fantasyland. I forget exactly what I said, but it's like in Evo Atheist Fantasyland, it's totally normal for the monkeys to rule the world, right? And I had, like a stupid looking human and then a like monkey in a suit, right? Like a chimp in a suit. And the concept, right, and the point being made for the majority of the atheists that responded, it was like way over their head. Some of them were like, a bunch of them argued, like their counter was, chimps aren't monkeys. And I'm like, and what was getting me is like, I'm aware of this, but chimp didn't rhyme as well. It didn't flow, right, as well as monkey did, right? Like, so
Yeah,
you're gonna go with a hyper literalist, like, you said monkey when it should have been chimp, versus you dumbasses think that monkeys could actually rule the world, right? Like,
well, they can sail the Atlantic to South America, I guess. So,
they can't say they can surf, man. They surfed. Come on now.
Well, I mean, some kind of maritime activity. I mean, to get that far, and survive the trip.
I mean, I'm being sarcastic. I mean, sail, surf, what? Who cares, man? Like,
it's not
the fact that you think monkeys were able to make it 1,800 miles on some freaking like leaves that were somehow tied together. They managed to float 1,800 miles from Africa to South America. Yeah, like, okay, that I buy that completely.
Well, they had to, because evolution's true, and here we are. But I would recommend it's Plantinga's argument. I think 1993. It's like, I think it's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, I think.
How does that one go?
Hey, sorry, you guys. I think I'm kind of sketched out here on my Wi-Fi, but it's cutting in and out.
No, it's all right, man.
Yeah. Totally good.
Oh, there he is. Yeah, it really is, man. I was actually having an interaction with some folks earlier about something else, and they questioned. It was I got the usual. So, are you an expert in insert topic? And I'm like, did I go to college for it? No. Have I taken advantage of the fact that more information is now available about X topic than for free that I can access on demand than there was available 30 years ago in a university library? It's like, I don't have to have a PhD in every topic to be able to go out and apply my brain power to learning about a subject to the extent that I understand the concepts
Well,
and
and
can interpret
especially,
things and apply it to a variety of other pieces of evidence and reach an end conclusion that has valid foundation from a knowledge-based perspective. And it's like, are you arguing that unless I go and get a PhD in XYZ topic, I can't understand the topic? Like, to me, that's so ridiculous. It's like going back to my earlier point of it's just willful suspension of rational thought, critical thinking, analysis, etc. It's like, in what other context would you make that argument that somebody can't learn enough to be able to understand a premise?
well, and I would even point out too, like in the modern day with the existence of the internet, I mean, we're getting to a point now where, like, I know this sounds kind of crazy to some people, but I think a lot of us are realizing quickly that it really isn't. College is becoming irrelevant because I can read Plato's Republic online or listen to it on an audiobook or buy it for $2.50 on Amazon. You know what I mean? I can do all these things with all these different books, and they're a click away, a purchase away, a play button away kind of thing. You know what I mean? And now we're getting to a point now where we have, so many. I mean, think of the field we're in right now, right? You, myself, Jonathan Sheffield, all autodidactic, meaning self-taught. On the atheist side, Matt Dillahunty is autodidactic. The Rage and Skylar Fiction are autodidactic. The point just being that, like, this is like we're in that era now where you really can learn this stuff, and it has its negatives.
Case in point.
Go ahead.
As a quick case in point, I think Jamie's like signed up recently for a online platform specifically for people that want to learn for like philosophical stuff online.
Yeah, it's by Josh Rasmussen.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, CJ. I would say that's a case in point, right? Like, Jamie's doing this as we speak, right?
Yeah, and you can cheat too. And if you go to college, you can just cheat if you want it. I mean, there's ways to cheat that, I guess. And so you go into college might just be getting a piece of paper and you don't learn that much. You can kind of see that in different people that you deal with or whatever. If you're not interested, it doesn't matter.
It's stunningly obvious. I mean, people have heard me on some of my streams go on tangents about this, but back when I was employing 30 people, I literally got to the point where I stopped, and this was now almost a decade ago, right? I got to the point where I was purposely not hiring college graduates. I was hiring self-taught people and literally having like job posts be, if like a software developer, be like, finish this function, send us the code, and you got yourself an interview. Guess who would finish the code and send it in to get an interview? It was the people that were self-taught, not the idiots that had the CS degree from Vanderbilt and other like high-level institutions, right?
Right.
Because they were too uppity to do it. And the irony was most of them didn't have the skills. Even with their 4-year computer science degree, they didn't have the skills to actually be a worthwhile hire.
Well, the thing about being autodidactic or also being apprenticed too, which is something you see a lot in trades, is that the way you learn it is actually by being actively involved in the information, right? Like, everybody's been in school and knows that you can just kind of cheat your way through school, right? That it's easy to just kind of. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I was completely and totally stoned out of my gourd in middle school. You know what I mean? Like, and yet I passed. And by high school, I just didn't care and I dropped out. But middle school still the same would apply, right?
That's incredible. It's hard to believe that, man. I mean, same with me. I didn't even apply myself or whatever, but I could get by, with B's or C's or whatever, just winging it kind of thing. And I wish I had done differently, but you can always learn. I'm more interested in learning now than I've ever been at 37. So I did
and that's the thing, right? When you're going to be self-taught, you literally, like, the fact that you're being self-taught means you have to be taking interest, right? So it's like, it's completely different than when you're learning in a classroom setting, because there is no cheating your way out of being self-taught. The only way to actually be properly self-taught is to go into the information and look at it. I wonder if Maddox will actually be coming back.
I bet he will. I did get that a little synopsis of that argument from Plantinga's thing. If you want me to read it real quick, it's in the chat. Let's see.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just from Wikipedia. It just gives a synopsis or whatever, but it says Plantinga. This is the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Plantinga argues that combining naturalism and evolution is self-defeating, because under these assumptions, the probability that humans have reliable cognitive faculties is low or inscrutable. He claimed that several thinkers, including C.S. Lewis, had seen that evolutionary naturalism seemed to lead to a deep and pervasive skepticism and to the conclusion that our unreliable cognitive or belief-producing faculties cannot be trusted to produce more true beliefs than false beliefs. It's kind of a little synopsis. You can read more of it online. I think you can probably get the paper somehow, or you can also there's more information on Wikipedia that explains it. But
yeah, and I also think too, just while the name was dropped, I do have to say one of my favorite philosophers of all time right there, and also theologians of all time, and also writers of all time, because he did everything. C.S. Lewis.
oh yeah, yep.
Well, and I did just notice we're hitting about 2 hours here, so I might want to start to get this to wind down a little bit, especially if it does look like we got about 2 viewers left, and I'm not sure if Maddox is actually coming back or not.
Sure thing, man.
But, anything else that you kind of want to say as like a final thoughts or anything?
Oh, nope. Just thanks for having me, and look forward to talking to you again, and have a good night.
Yeah, absolutely. And you as well. And I appreciate you coming on, of course, contributing to the conversation. It was a lot of good conversations. Looks like Maddox here is back. So I do want to give you the opportunity to kind of finish your thoughts and stuff, but I did think that we're going to kind of wind down here a little bit, just because we've been about over 2 hours, but nonetheless.
No, you good, man. My phone was acting weird. It was not letting me come back into the studio. It's weird. But I appreciate you doing the stream. I've enjoyed it, and always, as I always say, man, keep it up. You got a great future, and you're very knowledgeable. And it's been interesting to watch you just in the last over this past year. I've watched you grow a lot in your knowledge, your confidence, and the interaction. So it's always fun to observe. And yeah, I was gonna say, keep it up, man.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot, actually. Thank you. Especially, obviously, not to throw myself under the bus, but I am like almost always over a decade the people I am talking to's younger. So it's nice to know that I actually do put a good perception out there, I guess. But
hey man, don't ever doubt yourself because of your age. I joke about. I actually wrote a poem about this one time that I forget it was like a little short joke, but that I grew my beard so that people would stop thinking I was wet behind the ears when I was like being entrepreneurial, and then when I cut it off, they went back to thinking I was just a kid.
Right.
But I mean, at 24, I was going into boardroom. I was being an entrepreneur. I was going into boardrooms and presenting and convincing people to do business with me and my company and all that kind of stuff. And once you overcome any of that, it's like, actually I do know what I'm talking about, right? Like I am bringing something of value to the table, and I've got substance. And the second you recognize that, I'm not saying you don't, but I'm just talking in generalities. The second you recognize that you do, it's like, why should I allow my age? Now, does that mean you should be walking around being arrogant and be like, I'm superior? Of course not. Should you still try to strive to learn from people who came before? Absolutely. However, at the same time, it's also that line of demarcation where it's like, wait a minute, why would I don't need to acquiesce just because I'm younger, right? have substance. I think a lot of times the folks with the older demographics that have a lot of ego, they try to leverage that to intimidate the younger and convince you that you just don't know what you're talking about, especially when they're losing, right? And it's like, I don't need to yield. And
Right.
you know my little mode of like the difference between confidence and arrogance is the ability to back up your BS.
Yeah.
And if you back it up, then put your chips on the table. And it's like, if your objection is that I'm young, what's your point? I'm schooling you, and I'm young. So what does that say about you? Let's do a flip. But anyway, that's my little diatribe there. Anyway, wrapping up. But that's, like I said, man, just keep it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, and I agree with everything that you were saying there too. And especially because there's a lot of people who are shall we say, less than respectful about the fact that they are elders, right? They abuse the fact that they are elders. And that obviously is never something that is cool, but it does absolutely happen all the time. And I don't know, there's not much you can do about it, really. Like, it's just kind of the way that a lot of people are. I think that's a big part of the reason to get this into a little bit of a gospel thing for us to end. It's a big part of the reason why we need Christ, because really all of us are prone to something. Maybe you're prone to being arrogant about your eldership. Maybe you're prone to being arrogant about your knowledge. Maybe you're prone to being arrogant about your wealth, or being prone to being lustful, or whatever it happens to be. But you're prone to something. In fact, you're probably prone to a lot of things, and you're probably even prone to things you don't know about. And the message of Moses, which is very clear for us to see in the Old Testament, is that God is very, very angry with sin. He has a very high standard. He has a standard that is absolutely one of righteousness. He has a standard that is absolutely one of justice. And he keeps that standard, and he keeps it stringently. But the message of the cross, which comes after Moses, which Moses himself looked forward to, is that God himself came down in the flesh to sacrifice himself on the cross, that me and you might actually be saved from these wicked sins which we commit constantly. And so I want everybody to remember, Jesus Christ is Lord, is King, will be glorified today, tomorrow, yesterday, forever, is the same yesterday, today, forever. And we will all at some point meet him, whether it be in the air or just in heaven in general. So if the Lord tarries, we will see you again. Shalom. God bless you, and have a wonderful evening.